and welcome to Rasa Chats, the Rasa podcast where we talk about conversational AI. And today I'm joined with somebody else from Rasa, actually, who y'all may know already, and that is Vincent. Vincent, do you want to introduce yourself and say what it is that you do here and how it is that people might have run across you?
Sure. Hi, Rachael. We're colleagues. We're even in the same team, so it's kind of artificial to say hi to each other this way. But yes, hi, my name's Vincent. I'm also in the DevRel team. I do DevRel stuff and research stuff. I kind of interface between both teams. So I try to explain our algorithms, and at the same time, I also try to support the research team. And it's just some experiments that they do, run some benchmarks, talk to the community. That's mainly it. People might have known me from some of the videos I put up on YouTube, which includes the algorithm whiteboard. I'm that guy. But yeah, that's I've been doing that for like a year now. It's like I just had the yearly mark, I think.
Yeah. Happy anniversary.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think it might be interesting for folks. So of course, machine learning and NLP, well, NLP isn't that young of a field, but like being a machine learning person who does it professionally using neural methods is like a little bit of a new thing. So people get into it in a lot of different ways. And I'm wondering if you talk a little bit about your journey. How did you get into machine learning generally, NLP specifically, and how did you end up at Rasa?
So my background in the end is operations research, so pretty math heavy. And to be completely honest, before I joined Rasa, I didn't do that much NLP stuff, actually. The kind of what happened was I went to the Spacey in Real Life conference. I think it was 2019.
That's right.
And I was just, basically impressed by the whole field and sort of going like, this NLP stuff is just cool. It's a nice little different angle from most classification stuff that I've been doing till then. And you kind of start networking, and I met the people who founded the Spacey project. I got to know them a little bit, and via that sort of group of people, you start knowing more and more people. And at some point, I got approached by Rasa, and they kind of said, we have some algorithms that tend to be complex. And Vincent, we've been looking at your blog, and we think that you might be a person who would be pretty good at explaining things for us. So that's kind of how the ball got rolling. And I would the thing that I think works quite well is I don't consider myself an expert in NLP, like in any way or form. But because I don't have to consider myself an expert, I do like to think that I understand what it's like not to know how something works, which is really useful when you're trying to explain an algorithm in an intuitive way. So for a large part, that's the main thing that I try to do. I try to sort of also make some tools that help people understand Rasa, but I'm also on the learning journey myself. And I think that's the main thing I'm doing. I'm trying to learn Rasa, trying to figure out what it means to make proper conversations work. It's just that I tend to document a lot of it. That's the main difference between me and most of the colleagues in the research team, I guess.
Yeah, definitely an interesting journey. I think we're all still learning, right? If you're working in the technology field, things are always changing under you. So you.
Oh yeah, and we have I sometimes join you for the paper reading sessions as well, and I think Vova also joined. The main thing I like to remind myself of, people sometimes look at me as an expert, but I don't want to suggest that I have the answer to everything. Recently, one of the things that I was just researching is just spelling errors, and which is not a solved problem at all, but fairly relevant if we're doing, assistance online. I have pretty fat fingers whenever I'm typing on my iPhone, so I make plenty of spelling errors. That's like one of the many, 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 many aspects that you have to tackle when you're making a good assistant. But that is something I'm picking up this month. Like I have a trick that might help out with spelling. I just need to confirm it with the research team that I'm onto something. But that is like a little bit of research that I'm doing while I'm also working on like algorithm whiteboard videos.
Yeah, spelling is really interesting. So I'm dyslexic. You're dyslexic as well, right, Vincent?
Yeah, we're both. There's a surprising number of people who are dyslexic at Rasa. Look, we actually went into that a while ago. Like it's definitely way more than 10%. It's actually quite a number there.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have definitely, with my background in linguistics, I've noticed that people who have dyslexia or some sort of other language processing difference are more likely than the average person to be drawn into linguistics and work on language. So just random observation. But it's interesting because like the idea of spellings being stable is super recent. Like not just like with the invention of movable press, but like with the standardization of publishing houses. So we're talking like Shakespeare time, roughly, at least in English. And I think it was like synchronous with a lot of European languages. So
well, spelling is really changing in Europe as well. So like in German, you have the weird capital letter B. I think they call it a ringel S, which you pronounce as double S. I believe that that's been a process, how that's been evolving. Mm-hmm. I know in Dutch we have the AE, which is like Old Dutch, which yes. you still see that on the buildings, but like it's been removed from the language slowly. The Y, like for a very long time that there was a period of time where there wasn't really a Dutch letter, mm-hmm. Stuff like that. And then, you know, everything's turning a little bit English in Dutch language because of slang. So suddenly the spelling also changes because of that. Mm-hmm. But the main like thing that's interesting about spelling to me is there's this Dutch eBay. It's called Marktplaats. It basically means marketplace. But you go to the Marktplaats website, and then you just find out that there are like 6 different ways to spell barbecue. Especially if you're Dutch, because you know it's sort of an English word, so people have a little bit of trouble figuring out the Dutch spelling. But then if you're Marktplaats, like you want to recognize all 6 forms of spelling because they're not a typo. They're sort of how people actually think the word is supposed to be spelled.
That's variation.
Yes, and then that's the hard part about all of these spelling mistakes, because you can't just take the dictionary and match on that and hope everything's going to work out fine. Like that's not going to work. You need something of a system that's able to learn new ways of spelling. Mm-hmm. But the thing that I'm trying to research more is just the effect of typos. Mm-hmm. I guess it's a very specific type of spelling issue that I think is preventable, but still covers a lot of ground use case wise.
Yeah. I think something we briefly talked about in a different conversation is that typos are also not randomly distributed. So I think that there's a lot of people who are coming into this problem space for the first time are like, well, we have to be able to handle like any possible thing that people could do to produce a word incorrectly. But it's a pretty small set of things that people tend to do in typing. So they tend to like switch characters or skip characters is super common. Or like doubling characters is not as common in typing, right? Unless it's stylistic, unless there's a reason to double characters. So Gretchen McCullough, and I think Lauren Goyne, don't quote me on whether or not she's on that paper. But there's been quite a bit of work in linguistics on what does it mean when people are doubling or tripling letters in typing, and it's not people aren't doing it by accident usually. Usually it's like other things that constitute typos.
Well, and also like there's this book that you recommended me called Because Internet. Like if someone wants to exaggerate something online, they might say so with like many O's.
Yeah, that's Gretchen's book.
Yep, and you know, a cool book, by the way. A couple of cool things in there. But what I'm trying to do mainly is just look at the keyboard layout on the iPhone, because that's a pretty good source of a lot of different kinds of spelling errors. And what's kind of cool about that is, you know, I have pictures of different keyboard layouts across the world, so I can. There's this option that I might be able to specialize this also for Spanish and German and what have you. But again, I need to make sure that when you work on a feature like this, that you know there's people who properly look over your shoulder, make sure you benchmark it the right way. First, make sure you're onto something before you hit the big production button. But yeah, that's one of the many facets that I have found very interesting while working at Rasa. The international non-English aspect is also like something that I really like working on. That's also a big source of funny anecdotes. Recently, I was talking to one of our like community members. We were talking about Turkish and like how do you make a chatbot for Turkish? And one of the things I just randomly learned: did you know that the official rules for Scrabble are different in Turkish?
They're different in most languages. Well, a lot of distributions are different. What do you mean about the rules being different?
So it's not. So the thing is, what I've been told is it's not just that the points are different for different characters. Like that, obviously, that's different across languages. But apparently, the Turkish language is morphologically seen. It's so easy to make a word much longer, just because the language allows for it. that they have a rule that says, well, you can only write down the lemma of the word, because otherwise it's too easy to make super long words and the board wouldn't be big enough.
Interesting.
That was super interesting, but how on earth would you know about this unless you work at Rasa? Like, I would, if I were working at like a standard corporate, I mean, unless it's a company that's doing lots of multi-language things, you wouldn't know about these sorts of things, but they are relatively important. So that's really cool and unique about working, particularly for this role in Rasa. Like, there's just things about language that I would not have learned otherwise.
Well, language is great.
Mm-hmm. Yep, no, language is interesting. But yeah, but at the same time, like, besides just doing research, like, one of the things that I'm also trying to do is like, Rasa is, we try to make it as simple as we can get it, but it's still relatively complex if you think about all the moving parts that you need, right? So not only is it the machine learning stuff, it's also something in production. So we have to do logging. How do you explain it in a clean way? We also integrate with like Slack, so we also just have to explain how the software works. That's also something I would argue is relatively interesting as well, because explaining something the right way, in a way that you don't have to repeat yourself and that you can make like a good blog post that'll just last for 2 years. That's also an interesting challenge that, when you're doing, I was a consultant before. When you're a consultant, you have to deliver something in 2 months and then typically leave. Here, I'm trying to make something that lasts for like a couple of years. That's also like an interesting aspect of the work, I would say.
Yeah, and it's a little bit of a discussion of sort of doing DevRel, particularly Rasa, because I would say almost any way that you're going to get an assistant into production is going to rely on at least one integration. We're also relying on the things that we're discussing integrations with not changing. So a while ago, I did a tutorial on how to integrate with Alexa, and like a month after I finished, they changed. They like silently changed what sort of queries they would allow for an Alexa assistant. And so that you had to use their NLU, which I can see the argument for. I do wish they had told people they were doing it though, because like my tutorial was immediately no longer relevant. Which is a little frustrating. So yeah, it is definitely on the DevRel side. It is a balancing act because you want to do things that are going to be as helpful for the most people as possible. There's too many clauses. You want to help a lot of people, but you also don't want to have to redo a bunch of work very often, just because it's just not efficient and you're not going to be able to do as many things.
Yeah, and it's also like, and what's the minimum viable example that'll inspire people to just to do cool stuff? That's also usually the hard part. Because a while ago, I made this series on making a escape room experience for a virtual assistant.
It's called the Breakout Bot series on YouTube, if anyone's interested.
Exactly, the Breakout Bot. And I still think it was like a really cool project. The only issue, I think, was like people still enjoyed it. I still get compliments for it. But in the end, there aren't that many practical use cases or people interested in doing a virtual assistant that is an escape room at scale. Like, that's not the issue people typically have in their day-to-day. So the types of issues I was solving in that bot were not necessarily something community was interested in. I started making other content then, because when that became kind of clear. But that's the balancing act. Like, it's a balance.
Yeah, the DevRel in particular. So I know we're talking a little bit about our jobs, but I think it's relevant. And I think it's interesting, right? Because most folks in the Rasa community, I mean, if you're listening to the podcast, you have interacted with DevRel in some way. And it's not, I think, a super well-known career field.
Yeah, so before joining Rasa, I had no idea that there were DevRel conferences. Like, I had no idea that was a thing. Although I will say, like, one thing that's a little bit different in my role, I suppose, is I interact with some of the researchers, but I also make tools for them once in a while. But the funny thing that happens is when the research team thinks, like, I kind of need this visual, it'd be kind of nice if we had this Streamlit app, or it'd be kind of nice if we can just easily do this in a Jupyter notebook. One thing that I have found interesting is when I make tools for the researchers, that's also useful for the community. And it's also happened a bunch of times now that I ended up making something for the community that then the research team and like, that's the thing I needed. This is great. So one thing that's interesting about what I've been able to do at Rasa, at least, is I also commit to Rasa sometimes, but I've also been able to build tools on top of Rasa that will just help people debug the machine learning stuff. And some of these projects almost have 100 GitHub stars now, so I'm kind of excited. That's also something that we try to do a lot of, like especially in the non-English field. I try to maintain a couple of tools such that if you're making something in Croatian, there are word embeddings for Croatian, and I just make sure that they integrate with Rasa, so you can go ahead and use them if you wanted to. So there's also a lot of work that I get to do there, and that's quite rewarding, I have to say.
Yeah, it is nice to be able to do a lot of different things for sure. Speaking of other projects that you've worked on, is there anything that you've done that you really want to shout out and let people know about that might be helpful for them?
Yeah, so well, I think it's more because of it's a funny story. So I made this package called What Lies, and the
Mm.
idea for that was that I have this visualization toolkit, so I can figure out what lies in word embeddings,
Mhm.
and that was meant as sort of an educational tool. Um, and then I ended up writing a paper about it because it turned out that that tool was pretty useful to a whole bunch of people, which I hadn't really wasn't why I designed the tool. But
Mm.
one thing about it was just really nice is I got to write a paper about it, got properly published, etc. And as of yesterday, like the package has like a good 100, 200 downloads a month. And there's a whole lot of tools in there to benchmark non-English models real quick using scikit-learn as well.
Mhm.
So that's it's like a byproduct I've sort of it's a byproduct of my work at Rasa, but it's something that like the scikit-learn people really like because it helps them in their day-to-day do NLP stuff there. In general, I would say like that's the most fun part of my job is there's lots of byproducts, and it's not always to predict how people will use them,
Mhm.
but I now have this what was supposed to be a visualization package is now being used to run benchmarks as on scikit-learn, which is great. It's just not what I had expected what would have happened there. But what lies was cool. Like there's people, like all sorts of people are doing benchmarks for all sorts of non-English languages there. Again, so that's really cool. Um, I also think that the Rasa Lit project is really nice. It's just a bunch of Streamlit apps that you can use to visualize your machine learning models built with Rasa. There's also a spelling tool in there that I made a month ago, so you can check how robust your model is against spelling variation. That's definitely something that was a lot of fun to make. And then there's the Rasa NLU examples repository, and that's basically where I put all of my non-English tools that just integrate with Rasa right away. It's basically all the sort of tools that are probably useful to someone somewhere, but we can't just host that in Rasa just yet. We just put that in Rasa NLU examples, and it's kind of our machine learning contrib library that people are just more than welcome to toy around with.
Yeah, and we also have is that the one where we have a bunch of example intents as well? People can contribute data as to.
That's a different one. That's the we have the NLU training data repository. I also made a Streamlit app for that like a week ago, but that one is just training data to help you get started. So things like chit chat, if you want to ask the assistant things like, "Hey, are you a bot?" And then we have a bunch of examples for that, and that's just kind of nice because they're examples that most assistants should have around, and you can just copy and paste it and get started. That's also something that the community maintains, and something that if you're looking for your first contribution, definitely check that out. A final thing that I've started doing recently is similar, but this is name lists. So it turns out that not every pre-trained machine learning model is great at detecting names, especially if you have a chatbot that serves internationally. So one thing that we've started doing is we've started just collecting like very frequent baby names from around the world. Like to use that as a starting point to maybe detect names as well. You can use that to feed a regex, which is also something that might be very useful.
Yeah, I think particularly if you're doing something in the Latin alphabet.
Yeah, although the name list can of course also be non-Latin, but it is the main thing that people are asking for. In particular, we had a user on the forum. We said, well, I have Arabic names, but they have to be detected in French. And like that's a name list that was hard to fetch. And we had to find a place to maybe host that. So that name list is one of the name lists that we host. But yeah, but again, the way that that's also kind of the interesting thing about doing non-English. I am really not an expert. Like I'm super dyslexic, let alone do I only understand like Dutch and English. Like I'm not the best multilingual person. But if other people tell me like, hey, I have this use case for Arabic, could you please add this tool? It's kind of my job to just add those tools now. So if there are any tools that are currently missing from our stack, My name's Vincent. You can find me on Twitter. Just tell me what to do, and I'll make sure it integrates with Rasa.
And do you want to share your Twitter handle? Because I think if you just search for Vincent on Twitter, there's a lot of results.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that the only Vincent these days. No, but my name Fishnets88. But if you like query LinkedIn or just say Vincent Rasa, I'm pretty sure you'll be able to find me. But definitely, if there are tools in your language that exist but don't integrate with Rasa just yet, let me know and I'll work on an integration. That's what the Rasa MLU examples repo is for.
Oh, I will say, I don't know that I want to promise that everything is going to get done. No, but we'll look at it, right? We'll think about it.
So it's definitely going to get considered, but also I can at least point you to like even, to be honest, like most embeddings are actually pretty well done because if it integrates with Hugging Face, we already support it. If it integrates with Jensen, we already support it. But there are also like a bunch of tokenizers there that are pretty easy to copy and paste and exchange with something you wrote. So there's also plenty of examples I can point you to if need be. But yes, I cannot guarantee that I'll get to everything, but I would love to hear from you, though.
Yeah, definitely reach out if that's something that you're interested in. So I'm going to ask you a question that I like to ask people because I think it's really interesting. What was the best or the worst chatbot you've ever used?
Yeah, so I don't know. Like the word, Can I use company names, or is that a little bit lame?
I mean, it's up to you. If it's the worst, I would maybe leave that out. If yeah, it's the best, I would definitely use it.
So I think the best one. So there was someone from the community who said like, "Hey, I've made this chatbot. Vincent, could you just have a look at it?" Mm-hmm. And I said, "Okay, sure, I'll play around with it." But it was the first time that I actually was talking to an assistant using my iPhone. And what the assistant did was pretty interesting. Basically, the assistant didn't do a whole lot of like text, but mainly it wanted feedback from me using buttons. And that was something that worked, reasonably well for a long part of the conversation. And it's like this thing that people sometimes forget. Like UI can do a lot of good when you're making a conversation. Like if machine learning is hard, consider UI. But what I noticed is every time that I was using my fingers to actually type something, I would have the fat fingers effect, and the bot would just fail there. The interesting thing about that is I work for Rasa, so then I look at this from a different angle. I don't go, oh, this bot doesn't do what I want. Instead, I go, why is it failing? And that's how I actually got the inspiration to work on the spelling feature. Like that happened because I was talking to an assistant. To be honest, I really, there's this one demo, and I forget the company, but there's this one assistant where it's inside of, I think it's a banking app. You just talk to your assistant. You can ask, like, how do I change this setting? And then the app itself will pop up the button or like the form that you have to fill in. Like usually when I'm impressed by an assistant, it falls a little bit more into the UI category instead of the, hey, I can have like very long conversations with it. When you're a customer of a company, you're really just interested in just typing the thing you want and having the one thing then happen. So companies that do that well, I'm usually impressed by. It's like UI does impress me sometimes.
Yeah, there's a paper that came out in 2018, 2019 in there. I think the title was something like, why do people use chatbots? And it was huge survey data. They asked a lot of people who have used chatbots. And the number one thing that's made people say that they had a good experience with a chatbot was that it saved them time. So if you can do something more quickly, with natural language than you can by like clicking through a bajillion forms, that's a good user experience.
Like just as an example, this is an assistant I am sort of making for myself now. For my I have my own little Slack channel. I just want to have my own little Slack bot in there. But one of the things I always forget is like, oh wait, I have to do expenses. Okay, which was it? Expensify or Spendesk or like what provider was that again? I would love to just be able to ask that to an assistant and just say, oh, just fill in this link. It's automation that's a little bit more flexible than just buttons. Like if you just do that right, then you help a lot of people already.
Yeah, definitely. How can you take processes that are sticky and make them less sticky? No, usually sticky means people like doing it and want to do it a lot. Frictionful, full of friction.
How can you automate the boring parts? Like I have to go down this rabbit hole. How can you prevent that? Like that's always a good thing. It doesn't just hold for chatbots; it holds for most software, if I'm honest. But chatbots in particular.
So I think some good examples of good and bad chatbots, and then thinking about sort of advice for people who are building these things, which I imagine is a lot of people listening to this podcast. What are some really good best practices in building chatbots that you've noticed, or some anti-patterns, some things where you're like, people tend to do this, and it doesn't always work great.
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of I think this is a thing that most data science people have a tendency to do, I guess. But people look at like a data set and they go, ground truth. Let me grid search and let me do the big, try out all the embeddings and do
As
all
an
of that.
aside, never use grid search.
Yes. Well, I mean, so if you want to loop over a couple of embeddings, okay.
I mean, like use random search, not grid search. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I know it's true, but like the thing is, it's not the most meaningful thing you can do because the data that you start out with probably is data that you came up with yourself. It's not something that the user actually typed in. So the best thing you can just do is listen to your users more. And I really wouldn't worry about the machine learning part unless if you've been in production for like a good month. The best example I have of this is just that when I was making the breakout bot, a colleague of ours was, playing with, like, I asked this colleague, like, hey, I have this chatbot, it's an escape room, it's like a video game. Could you interact with it? And I'm just curious to see what would happen. I thought, most people knew how to play video games and they kind of knew the setting of what a text-based adventure game might be like. This person, however, looked at the thing and said, this is like a video game. Whenever I see my boyfriend play a video game, usually he's shooting things. So probably it's the goal that I have to break many things in this room. So instead of like playing this text-based adventure where you pick up items and combine them, this person just thought, like, if I type break the door will break. I totally forgot to add a tutorial on how a text-based adventure game should work. And if I just added that, the experience would have been way better. And machine learning is not going to help you figure this stuff out. And there's many, many anecdotes that are like this where, I didn't realize people were interested in asking this question. And then, that's the path forward. A grid search is not going to tell you which intents to add or remove. Only users are going to be able to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good sort of general piece of advice. You have to be very far along in the chatbot development process before your biggest gains are not going to come from either restructuring your intents or adding more data.
Yeah, and also
at least in intent classification accuracy.
Yeah, but also like with intent classification, I mean, you can run a few benchmarks on it, and it's fine and whatever. It's something you can do, but the real hard part of an assistant is not predicting the intent. It's coming up with the right action that follows. Like that's the hard part, because that revolves a lot around context and what you've done in the conversation so far, and that's also something that's much harder to properly benchmark. I think one of the reasons why there's lots of papers on intent classification, it's not so much that that's a more meaningful task. I think it's just a more well-defined task. So it's easier to compare numbers, but it's not to say that number is the one number that defines how well your assistant's going to be doing.
Yeah, that's like, how do you know how well the conversation is going and what metrics do you use for that? I think is very much an open question. Actually, the last paper we read in the paper reading group was proposing a new metric for that, for chit chat rather than task-oriented dialogue systems, but it was really interesting. And it was, I don't know if you watched that one. I don't assume everybody watches all my videos because there's a lot of them. But basically, their key metric was two assistants chatted to each other, which anti-pattern for generating training data, but for this I think makes sense. And the goal at each turn, each sort of like set of turns, was for someone who was looking at the data to guess which of the assistants was human, or if they were an assistant. And then it was a survival analysis over time, and the idea was like, the longer your assistant survived before someone was like, this is a bot, the better it was at being human.
Yeah, okay, there's some sense in that. But it is very much an open question though. Like that's the thing that always just sticks with me. And also the thing is, like, even if you come up with a very good general metric, it might very well be that the assistant that you're making is just really specific. So then you will and most assistants tend to be kind of specific. So you always have to, maybe for your specific company, come up with like one or two metrics that just makes sense to your company.
I think one that people tend to use in a commercial setting is, how many conversations do I end up needing to pass off to a human?
Yeah, that's a fair proxy. And some other things that people have told me they do is like, is the general sentiment in the conversation positive at all times? Then you can get the proxy for that. It's
Sentiment analysis is
oh, it's super hard, right? Super
oh,
hard
I was
get
going to
right.
say lossy.
Yeah, no, but so it's by no means a perfect metric, but it's as long as you don't optimize for it, it is a proxy. And you can sometimes say like, hey, if during one part of the conversation, like the sentiment always just sort of goes haywire, okay, that if nothing else, a human should look at that. Like that's the signal that you're typically interested in. And I, and also I think the attitude of it's perfectly fine if the assistant doesn't automate everything away for you to like some degree of optimality. You probably need a human in the loop for like a lot of moments, especially because the world is changing. So you always need to have like a little group of people making sure that the assistant is still up to scratch. And, yeah.
But even if you can automate one thing really well, that I think honestly that's worth the investment if it's something that happens a lot, right? Is it saving you time overall?
No. True. No, and like, the assistant can do like suppose that you because that's the thing that I've been thinking about lately as well. I can imagine for a lot of people who sort of think about assistants, they think about it's a company and the assistant's sort of a way to talk to their customers. That's fine. But lately, I've been hearing a lot of stories about people saying, "Well, we have assistants, but we don't use them for our customers. We use them for our own internal people." And if you have something like Slack, you want to book a holiday. Okay, suddenly you don't have to phone your boss or like HR about that. You can just put that into Slack and arrange the whole thing from there. Like that's also kind of perfectly fine. It's a nice constraint problem. But if this is saving you lots of like work hours, that's great. Well done there.
Saving time. So, coming back to that point.
Yeah, basically. But also like don't feel ashamed if like the assistant only does a few things in the beginning. If it does a couple of things like really, really well and it still solves a problem for a lot of people, like call it a win. Don't be ashamed of that. Like call it a win, like because it is
much easier to start small and add functionality than the reverse. Much easier.
Yes.
Right. Well, I think we're going to have to start wrapping up. But before we do, are there any last things you want to pitch to the community or let people know about or bring up?
Like the main thing, I guess, is if you have any sort of issue that's somewhat research related, definitely ask on our forum and maybe ping me, especially if it's machine learning related. My alias on the forum is Koning, Koaning. And the main reason is I'm trying to make content such that some of the harder to understand machine learning parts is just easier to grasp. And if I'm made aware of what parts are confusing, that will help me make like better docs and that sort of thing. So definitely like go to our forum, and if you have any sort of questions, reach out to me because that'd be a source of inspiration to me. Like a lot of people don't recognize that. They sometimes feel ashamed to ask because they think it might be bothering me. Don't. It's my job, and you're making it easier if you just ask me questions. So definitely just keep doing that.
I would say the forum is also not just for research questions. Any questions you have?
Any questions, certainly. But I do know more about neural networks than I do about WebSockets. That's if you have questions about WebSockets, I might ask a colleague to drop by.
All right. Speaking of dropping by, thank you for joining me today on the podcast. Stay tuned, listeners, for listening to my dog whine. Hi, bud. Yeah, you can come on up. He wants to come up on my lap. Here. Hi. Hello.
Benson.
Stay tuned for shout out for our new contributors. We're always delighted to have people contributing to Rasa, and when it's your first contribution, we'll give you a little shout out in the podcast. So thank you for joining, Vincent. Stick around, and we'll see you next time on Rasa Chats.
Thanks for having me. Have a good one, everyone.
Thanks so much for joining us today for Rasa Chats, and I'm going to end up by reading the names of all of our new contributors. Thank you so much for your contributions to Rasa. We're delighted to have you as part of the community. And if I mispronounce your name, please reach out to me on Twitter. I'm RCTATMAN, and I will correct it next time I record the podcast. So without further ado, thank you to our new contributors. Alex Yuen, Mandy Gu, Athena Sarav, Arohi Singla, Paulina Weist, Tino Kalinich Frederick, Nils Ferdela, Jacob Kempter, Thomas Kaffen-Soon, Tobias Lackermeyer, Dima Koltovich, Hans, Yohar Sabir, Mohammed Umair Arshad, Wasim Shahzad, and Peter Janik. Thank you so much for your contributions to Rasa. We're delighted to have you, and we look forward to what you do in the future. Everybody else, thank you so much for joining Rasa Chats, and we'll see you in a couple weeks. Bye!